So today I'm going to be talking about Polish literature and also Polish politics somewhat, but really I'll be talking about Polishness in general, I would say. And I must admit that I'm a bit amused that it's happening today, November 11th, because it's the Independence Day in Poland. We celebrate a holiday commemorating regaining of the independence in 1918 after 123 years of partition. I don't know if Anya, the organizer, designed it this way. I'm not sure. Maybe it was Providence, as the main character of this lecture would say, I think, maybe. Adam Mickiewicz, of course, I'm talking about. And rightly, I think, who is considered the founding father of Polishness. A somewhat dead and forgotten father, as some believe, at least since 1996, because that year, Maria Janion, the most renowned scholar of Romanticism in Poland, wrote one of the most widely discussed texts in Poland, The Eclipse of the Paradigm, in which she announced the end of the hegemony of the Romanticism in Polish culture. This hegemony, according to her, had persisted in Poland since the post-partition era and came to an end when Fukuyama's End of History arrived in Poland, along with the postmodernist ideas and the establishment of a liberal democratic state. In other words, when Poland became westernized. Until that time, according to Janion, Romanticism reigned in Poland. And not just any Romanticism in a general sense, but rather a Romanticism of very specific genealogy. This is what Maria Janion wrote in 1975 in her probably most known book, Gorączka Romantyczna, or Romantic Fever. This, Polish culture, lacks alternative threats, especially genuine opposition to the first great one, to Mickiewicz. It lacks grand pamphlets on the board, a fundamental revision of his myth, an attempt to contrarily split him in order to disrupt the priestly monolith and close sacrality. The antagonism of the bards, which was supposed to be a surrogate for the struggle of opposites and the conflict of attitudes in Polish culture, ultimately turned into the triumph of the one God, Mickiewicz. One could therefore say that in Janion's opinion, Adam Mickiewicz was the father of Polish culture. A father who dies, in a symbolic sense, in the 1990s, thanks to the Western philosophical ideas and the new political and economic system. But did he really? And do the ideas of liberal democracy truly contradict Mickiewicz's thought? So much so that it's either one or the other. When we talk about the Polish books Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk and Kinderszenen by Jarosław Marek Rymkiewicz, written more than 10 years after Janion announced the eclipse of the romantic paradigm, I will try to demonstrate that Mickiewicz's thought is still very much alive in Polish literature. And that's because it's still very much alive in Polish political imagination. Even more, I would argue that Mickiewicz thought still creates political landscape to this very day. So before we talk about Tokarczuk and Rymkiewicz, let's talk about the political thought of Mickiewicz, mostly his concept of messianism. So this is the general definition of Mickiewicz's messianism, a vision of history combining religion and politics in which Poland, through the martyrdom and deprivation of earthly power, becomes the chosen nation destined to play the role of Messiah of humanity and bring its salvation through a spiritual and political revolution. There are many themes that Mickiewicz's messianism is built on. There's religious vision of history and the fulfillment of the Providence plan, there's catastrophism and historical eschatology, this concept of a chosen nation and a chosen individual, the idea of historical mission and mandate from God, there's salvic power of suffering and sacrifice, there's logic of death and, as rebirth, there's unity of visible and invisible words, revelarization of folklore, magic and mystery, there's rejection of primacy of reason, there's primacy of inspiration, and the concept of revolution as a vengeful act destroying the existing order. But if we read all this as a story that Mickiewicz tells, we can identify two main characters of this story. There's Poland and there's the world, which appear here in a very interesting configuration, constituting two threads that Mickiewicz ideological and political construction is built on. There's nationalism and internationalism. And I will try to untangle this construction a little by presenting both threads in Mickiewicz's work. I will begin with the concept of internationalism. So Mickiewicz's internationalism lies in an idea, or two ideas, Christianity and socialism. In these two ideas, it is these two ideas that are to be spread throughout the world and save it. In his Paris lectures, while explaining the dogmas of Messianism, Mickiewicz says, thus, according to the historical course of Poland, according to the way Christianity was applied to politics in this country, according to the feelings of national writers, humanity has never gone and will never go any other way than through a series of revelations. And later, the final conclusion indicated in particular by the historical course of Poland was the acceptance of Messianism, or a series of revelations. It is revelation, and thus the Christian idea, that is to be realized in the future of the world, and on which the political revolution is to be based on. However, alongside the Christian idea, there is also the socialist idea. In his lectures, Mickiewicz develops it based on the category of property. He says, slavery is very ancient in the world, but the idea of unlimited power of animals, trees, the earth, all of nature, the idea that man is its center, its God, its unlimited despot, is the idea of the modern age, the ultimate expression of philosophical pride, the danger, as we have said, that property brings with it. According to Mickiewicz, the idea of unlimited ownership is reflected in modern law. He says, the public and criminal legislation of contemporary states is assessed differently by various religious and political schools, but almost all publicists, almost all philosophers consider that part of it that deals with property to be an expression of progress and improvement and almost perfect. The interest in property predominates in all codes. But all this is about to change, according to Mickiewicz. He says, man is considered the unlimited master of property. At present, there are cries against property and all the laws that govern it. Schools are being established, notably in France, that seek to overturn property from its foundations or to limit it in a way that would completely change current legislation. One should not think that all these ideas express only the anger of the poor, the proletariat, or that all these projects are motivated only by blind envy of property, or finally that these schools want to deceive public opinion by covering up their political passions with these theories. The evil lies much deeper. According to Mickiewicz, this evil is property itself, which must be renounced. The socialist idea based on the renunciation of property is not only not opposed to the Christian idea, according to Mickiewicz, but is closely related to it. Mickiewicz speaks about this in his lectures. He says, the issue of property is connected with the issue of religion, and it is obvious that the time is coming when this issue should be arranged in a new way. This time coincides with the universal expectations of the peoples. The world feels the need for a new light to shine, one that could illuminate our relationship with God and with nature, one that would allow us to grasp more truly and deeply the bond that connects man with God and with nature. Only after receiving this light will it be possible to shed new and effective light on the relationship between man and property. Those who will bring this good news to the world and purify it of property are, of course, the Poles. But the Poles will not be alone. After all, as we know, the Poles are to save the world in cooperation with other Slavic nations. According to Mickiewicz, this is to be the case for several reasons. First of all Slavs, due to their piety, consider property, especially property of land, to be a sin. As Mickiewicz says in his lectures, According to Slavic understanding, property belongs to this group of people, to this collection of families, to this swan called a borough, or in Polish, gmina. The fundamental concept of Slavic peoples is that owning land is a sin. This is the basis of all Slavic legislation, that a person is not allowed to own land. And so, before taking possession of property, the Slavs perform a ritual of exorcism. Additionally, according to Mickiewicz, it is the Slavs who have been affected by the most severe historical experiences, exile and slavery. In other words, they are the personification of the lack of property. And as Mickiewicz says, only these people, already stripped of everything on earth, can be the first to understand what should one day reign on earth. God always begins to gather his battalions and create his retainers only from beggars and simpletons. This is his principle. However, the Slavs are not alone in the world. According to Mickiewicz, the Slavs are moving westward. He says, nowhere is the desire to get closer to Europe, to establish closer relations with the peoples of the West, so alive and so widespread as in the Slavic race. Mickiewicz is referring mostly to France. According to Mickiewicz, Poland and France are linked by a common destiny and are kindred spirits in general. And that is why, as Mickiewicz says, Polish messianism cannot remain outside the European movement. It cannot be independent of France. Poland, together with the Slavs and the French, is to bring peace to the world, or at least to Christian Europe, because that's what he emphasizes the most. So perhaps we're not talking about universalism here, but we are undoubtedly dealing with some form of internationalism. In his lecture, Mickiewicz speaks of the union of peoples and the creation of a new community. He says, the Slavic tribe and the Polish nation are destined and prepared to create a completely new community. The community will not exist outside the categorical framework of the nation. However, it will create something like a new nationality composed of different peoples, as Mickiewicz says. The present era is preparing something even more extensive and universal. The creation of new people, or rather many peoples, whose calling will be to form a new nationality, which we cannot yet conceive, like European Union maybe. It can therefore be assumed that Polishness, like other national identities, will be replaced by something else or sacrificed in the service of an idea that will create a national community based on diversity, a new type of internationalist nationality. Yeah, the problem is that Mickiewicz also presents the opposite view. Because according to Mickiewicz, what's foreign is dangerous. It applies first of all to foreign people. In the books of Polish pilgrimage, instructing Polish emigrants, Mickiewicz says, remember that you're amongst foreigners, like sheep among wolves, and like a camp in an enemy country, and there will be harmony among you. And further, not all of you are equally good, but even the worst of you is better than a good foreigner. Let's note that Mickiewicz writes it in 1832, when he lives in Paris, which he loves, right? Because the French. Well, according to Mickiewicz, foreign inferiority applies not only to the people and their character traits, but also to ideas, including philosophical ideas. According to Mickiewicz, the rationalist philosophy of the Enlightenment is the worst of them all. He says, philosophy, rather what has come to be called philosophy, that is the work of reason, which breaks away from all rules, which does not want to submit to any condition imposed on providence, is, from this point of view, only an imitation, or rather a falsification of revelation. But it's not only the Enlightenment thinkers who are mistaken. The French socialists, the cosmopolitan French socialists, well, also say stupid things, according to Mickiewicz, and the things that are, if are applied, would lead to absurdities. As he says, let us now ask the cosmopolitan reformers, those who attempt to establish communities under the names of Fourierists, Saint-Simonists, or Owenists, How can we find a religious and moral theory that could be equally understood and implemented by Germans, Englishmen, Frenchmen, the Russian government, and Poles? It would be necessary either to deny the existence of all nationalities and abolish them, or to recognize them all and equally support their development and activity. A theory that would equally increase the power of the English and French, the Russian government, and the Poles would bring about no change. It would prolong the war indefinitely and make it even more terrible. It is easier to be a cosmopolitan than a patriot. What is more, Mickiewicz claims that Poles knew and spread socialist ideas even before it was fashionable, so before the French. He says, in Pan Tadeusz, using the words of character Podkomorzy, who in a conversation with some other character tells a story about Podczaszy, who, when Podkomorzy was still young, brought various political and social innovations from France. So the character Podkomorzy says, Podczaszy announced that he would reform us, civilize us, and constitute us. He announced to us that some eloquent Frenchman had made a discovery, that all people are equal. Although this had long been written about in the Lord's order, and every priest says the same thing from the pulpit, the teaching was old. It was about putting it into practice. So the Poland put it into practice, and had been putting it into practice long before the French. And also, the Christian Polishness is a completely sufficient condition for freedom and equality. It is everywhere else that the ideas are not put into practice. Thus, Poland does not go beyond itself towards others. It doesn't because all other nations are against Poland. And he says so in the lectures. He says the entire political and philosophical march of Europe is diametrically opposed to the political and religious march of Poland. Therefore, Mickiewicz treats drawing on foreign influences as something dangerous, even as a disease, which, in left untreated, has disastrous consequences. Podkomorzy speaks of this in Pan Tadeusz. He says, suddenly, young gentlemen from foreign countries invaded us in hordes worse than the Nogais, persecuting God, the fate of our ancestors, laws and custom, even the old dresses in our homelands. This rabble had great power over minds, for when God punishes a nation, he first takes away the citizens' reason. And so the wise did not dare to resist the dandies, and the whole nation feared them like a plague, for it already felt the seed of disease within itself. The dandies were shouted at, but they were taken as role models. Faith, language, laws, and clothing were changed. It was a masquerade, a carnival revelry, after which a great fast was soon to come, enslavement. Mickiewicz says this himself in his Paris lectures, telling the story of Michał Wielchorski, a court official who, after the first partition of Poland, turned to Western Enlightenment thinkers, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for advice on the political system for Poland. According to Mickiewicz, this advice had this effect. People stopped protesting against the partition, thus legalizing the first partition, and forgot about the land separated from the Republic. A crime of treason was committed. Here we can see how extremely dangerous it is to adopt foreign politics and ideas in any matter, because every nation is based on its own political principles. However, according to Mickiewicz, the problem is not only that every nation is based on its own political principles, it is also that, in Mickiewicz's opinion, all foreign principles, moral, legal, cultural, are fundamentally corrupt and terrible. And this is certainly true of Western civilization. Mickiewicz writes about this in the books of Polish pilgrimage. He says, the word civilization used to mean citizenship, from the Latin word civis, citizen. A citizen was a person who sacrificed himself for the homeland. But then, in an idolatrous confusion of languages, civilization came to mean fashionable, exquisite clothing, delicious cuisine, comfortable inns, beautiful theaters, and wide roads. Verily I say unto you, It is not you who should learn civilization from foreigners, but you should teach them through the true Christian civilization. It was addressed to Poles, of course. To be fair, Mickiewicz teaches that civilizational superiority applies not just to Poles, but to all Slavs. But he also speaks of civilizational disease among the Slavs, the manifestation of which is, for example, the Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great. He says, the ultimate decay of what we call civilization produces isolated cases of moral disease, similar to the condition that is common amongst the Asian tribes. The 18th century produced examples of true Mongolism. Catherine was not a Mongol by birth, but she was truly Mongolian in her spirit, upbringing, and the 18th century ideas. She perhaps embodied the idea of the age in the fullest. The woman was the mysterious marriage of the 18th century with the system of great Moscow princes, like represented by Ivan the Terrible and his successor. It was a cold, insensitive, rational civilization instilled in the Slavic soul. The foreign disease is therefore contagious and extremely dangerous. Even Slavic nations are not safe. It seems that the only salvation is to hold on to one's own national identity, untainted by foreign influences. However, this theme, the nationalist theme, is not without its problems for Mickiewicz either. Nationalism also functions as a disease in his work, another kind of evil. It is best seen in his literary works. In part 3 of Dziady, nationalism is a disease of the soul or possession by an evil spirit, which afflicts the main character, Konrad, who is a prisoner in Russian prison. In the scene before great improvisation, the most famous of all, Konrad, feasting in his cell with his fellow prisoners who have come to visit him, sings a significant song, foreshadowing the monologue that will take place later. Konrad singing. The song was already in the grave, already cold. It sensed blood. It looks up from under the ground, and like a ghost it rises hungry for blood. It demands blood, demands blood, demands blood. Yes, revenge, revenge, revenge on the enemy, with God or even against God. So Konrad, the Polish hero, declares his desire for revenge at any cost, even against God. This song understandably terrifies one of Konrad's friends, Father Lvovich, a priest, who says, "Konrad, stop, for God's sakes, this is a pagan song." And indeed, Konrad's song is not the song of a Christian bringing salvation to the world. It is the song of a nationalist. Now, why do I say nationalist and not a patriot? Well, for sure, in his monologue addressed to God, which happens right after this scene, Konrad declares a great love for his homeland. However, this love is not innocent. Konrad wants power over the nation. He says, "The power I have over nature, I want to exert over human souls. Like birds and stars, I rule with a wave of my hands, so I must rule over my neighbors." This power, just like revenge on enemies in Konrad's song, is to be with the nation, or, if the nation opposes it, against the nation. And Konrad says it directly. He says, "Let them guess what I want right away. They will fulfill it and thus be happy, and if they resist, let them suffer and perish." Konrad therefore has his own vision of Polishness, the only one he can accept. And the interests of the nation coincide with those of Konrad, because in his vision he and the nation are one. He says, "My homeland and I are one. My name is Million, because for millions I love and suffer torment." We know that when Konrad says this, he is suffering from madness, not only because we can guess it from the words. The illness is also diagnosed by another character, Father Piotr, a monk who visits the young prisoners, bringing them comfort. For Father Piotr, it is clear that Konrad is possessed by an evil spirit. And so he begins to perform an exorcism. This is how it goes. Father Piotr says, "Unclean spirit, I know you by your venom. You are here again, the most cunning of all devils. You're creeping into this abandoned house again, you ugly reptile. You have crawled into his mouth. You have crawled in here to destroy him. In the name of the Lord, I have captured you and cast you out. Exorciso." We know that the spirit is a demon of nationalism. We know this because Father Piotr addressing Konrad says, "Pray, for the Lord's hand has touched you terribly. The mouth with which you have offended the eternal majesty, the mouth the evil spirit has defiled with hideous words, words of folly, the harshest torment for wise lips. May they be counted as penance, may you forget them." And Konrad replies to this, "They are already there, carved." Konrad points to the inscription that he had carved on the wall of his cell, which announces the death of his previous incarnation, a young, lovesick poet Gustav, and the birth of the patriot, nationalist incarnation, Konrad. This is the inscription. The inscription is in Latin, but it's not a foreign copy, unless it is a foreign copy. It is a foreign copy of an idea of nationalism instilled in the previously untainted Polish soul. Either way, it is a declaration of the birth of a new man, a political man, and a national man. Father Piotr considers these words carved in stone to be sinful, and he says so explicitly. He says, "May you, sinner, never read them yourself. May God never ask you about their meaning. Pray, your thoughts clothed in dirty words." Nationalism is thus presented here as the work of an evil demon. And yet, Mickiewicz does not push the nationalist theme aside. Despite the problems it raises, this theme, alongside the theme of internationalism, continues to be a lead in his thought. And both themes resonate in contemporary Polish literature. But, since they're contradictory, they do so separately, showing two political paths of Mickiewicz's thought in Poland. I will start with Olga Tokarczuk. Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk is a novel set in a secluded mountain village on the Polish-Czech border. The narrator is an eccentric elderly woman Janina Duszejko, an astrologer, animal lover, and opponent of hunting. The tranquility of the area is disturbed by a series of mysterious deaths of hunters and local notables. Each death seems strangely linked to the cruel treatment of animals, and Janina hypothesizes that nature is taking revenge on her tormentors. However, no one takes her seriously. As the plot unfolds, an atmosphere of paranoia grows, and the protagonist, using horoscopes and intuition, tries to uncover the perpetrator, becoming increasingly obsessed. In the finale, it is revealed that Janina herself killed those responsible for animal cruelty, becoming a vigilante, dispensing her own justice. Threatened with responsibility, she flees across the border to the Czech Republic, where she hides from punishment. The novel teaches on the edge of crime, ecological manifesto, and the ethical treatise, questioning human domination, social hypocrisy, and the impunity of institutional violence. Already in this description, the themes present in Mickiewicz's messianism immediately catch the eye. Tokarczuk's book features all of these in one form or another. However, since we're talking about internationalist threat, let's focus on that. In Tokarczuk's novel, Mickiewicz's internationalist trope undergoes certain reconfigurations, but at its core it remains kind of the same. This trope, in the most literal sense, is manifested in the figure of the border and its crossing. The border, as in Mickiewicz thought, is both a geopolitical and moral concept. Mickiewicz's aim was to create a broader spiritual community transcending national borders and spanning the diverse peoples of Europe. Tokarczuk, employing a radically different narrative matter, achieves a similar gesture. The national form of Polish society proves insufficient, and its moral structures lead not to salvation, but on the contrary, to decline. In this context, the placement of the good on the side or on the other side of the border becomes particularly telling. In the narrator's imagination, the Czech Republic is an alternative space, free, intuitive, untouched by patriarchal law and institutional violence. The narrator speaks of this directly in the context of her work with a former student of hers, translating the work of William Blake, Dyzio. Dyzio recently told me that he found a decent edition of Blake in a small bookstore in Náchod, Czech Republic. So we can now imagine that those good people who live on the other side of the border, who speak to each other in a soft, childlike language, light fires in their fireplaces in the evenings after work and read Blake. Here, man is no longer guided by the rules of reason, stupid and rigid, but the heart and intuition. People don't pour from empty to empty, showing off what they know, but create extraordinary things using their imagination. The state ceases to be a shackle, a daily nuance, and helps people realize their dreams and hopes. And man is not a cog in a system or role, but a free being. You will be the judge of this. I don't know. The point is that Tokarczuk seems to attribute to Czech social space a quality that Mickiewicz called a new nationality, a community transcending existing political forms built on spiritual covenants. Unlike the Czech Republic, the Polish side of the border is a space of decline. Capricious law, cruel reason, perverted authority, and violence against the weak. The narrator views Poland much as Mickiewicz viewed Europe infected with the disease of civilization, as a world that has lost its moral center. The axis of this dispute then runs not so much or not only between nations, rather between two moral orders. On the Polish side, the state supports and sanctions violence against animals in the name of reason, property rights, and anthropocentric domination. We know this from the description of the first person to lose their life due to their own cruelty. The Duszejko, Janina Duszejko, describes him this way. I also knew he poached in every possible way. He treated the forest like his farm. Everything there belonged to him. He was a plunderer. The plunderer and the poacher, though theoretically acting illegally, was protected by the law. The law, as we encounter it in Poland, is a patriarchal law of property, ownership, and cruelty. This theme emerges in one of the key scenes in which Duszejko confronts a group of hunters. Oh, no. Oh, okay. So the scene goes like this. I saw them walking in a loose formation, 20, 30 men in green uniforms, camouflage uniforms, and those ridiculous hats with the feather. What the hell is going on? I shouted. One of them, a helper, approached me. You are not allowed to shoot at living beings, I shouted at the top of my voice. The wind snatched the word from my mouth and carried them across the entire plateau. Don't get upset, we are in the law. That's what he said, in the law. So Polish law, instead of protecting life, enables killing. It's the very perversity of law that was one of the Mickiewicz's main obsessions. Modern codes perpetuated unjust property relations which brought with them enslavement and violence. Tokarczuk reconfigures this motif from an ecological planetary perspective. Law becomes a tool of patriarchal domination, hunting, and land ownership, giving them an aura of rationality. The border, in Mickiewicz's sense, marks not the space of the state, but also the boundary of good. In fact, the main character flees to Czech Republic rather than seeking refuge with the Polish community. And this is a significant gesture that says salvation lies beyond the national form of politics. This way, Tokarczuk reconfigures Mickiewicz's intuition that Polishness must be transcended by entering into a broader system of spiritual solidarity. In this novel, goodness does not belong to the Poles. Polishness does not guarantee access to values. On the contrary, goodness and community reside beyond Polish literal and symbolic territory. In this sense, Tokarczuk reverses Mickiewicz's vector. If for the poet it was Poles who were to save Europe, in Tokarczuk it is Europe personified by the Czech Republic that saves Poles, offering them a model of life untamed by the violence and law. The Czech Republic becomes a space of the non-decline, a kind of residual Eden, safe from the catastrophe of law and reason. Mickiewicz believed that property is the sin of modernity. Tokarczuk replies that the sin is the relationship of property to nature, and consequently, the right of men to kill other beings, with the blessings of the state law and moral law of the church. The connection between these two laws is revealed in the novel in a scene that takes place in a church during the celebration of Saint Hubert's Day, the patron saint of hunters. The main character describes the mass at which the priest delivers a sermon. It seemed clear to me why hunting boxes, which after all more resemble concentration camp guard towels, are called ambos. In the ambo, men places like, in Polish it's called ambona. I don't know how it is in Czech. Anyway, in the ambo, a man places himself above the other beings and grants himself the right to the life and death. He becomes a tyrant and a usurper. The priest spoke inspiredly, almost in exaltation. Subdue the earth. It is you, to hunters, that God addresses these words, because God makes man his collaborator, to participate in the work of creation and to see his work carried out until the end. Hunters realize their calling to care for this gift of God, which is nature, consciously, rationally, prudently. Polish church is thus presented here as radically unsocialist and unchristian in Mickiewicz's sense of the word. Yet it is precisely the church that sanctioned patriarchal Polish property law, siding with Polish tradition, which is the side of evil. Ultimately, internationalism in the novel reveals itself as a transgression of the national construct of law and an entry into a dimension where morality knows no bounds. The protagonist flees to the Czech Republic because the Polish symbolic community no longer holds a place for her. Moreover, as she notes, Poland is incapable of creating a community at all, she says. No, people in our country lack the ability to organize and form a community, even under the banner of a mushroom. It's a country of neurotic individualists, each of whom, as soon as they find themselves among others, begins to lecture them, criticize them, insult them, and demonstrate their undoubted superiority. The Czech Republic, however, is a different story. She says, I think it's completely different in the Czech Republic. There people can discuss things calmly and no one argues with anyone. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't, because the language isn't suited to argument. It seems then that the border separates not only states but also spiritual orders. And just as in Mickiewicz's work, the Slavic nations were meant to be the seed of a new community of nations, in Tokarczuk's work, the Czech Republic is a remnant of the world in which man is a free being. In this way, Tokarczuk's novel aligns with Mickiewicz's internationalist idea. Nation is no longer the highest moral category. Crossing the border becomes an ethical necessity. And it is precisely beyond the Polish community that a chance of the redemption appears. All of this makes Tokarczuk an obvious enemy of the Polish right. This is a statement about the movie based on this novel, which was published in the right-wing media outlet Tygodnik Solidarność. The movie Spur, Pokot in Polish, is critical of hunting practices, but also of the Polish provinces, which are supposedly being regressed, among other things, through its association with the Catholic faith. What this means is that Tokarczuk, since she's anti-hunting and anti-Catholic, and thus anti-Polish province, is an anti-Polish writer. And actually, for a time, her Wikipedia page, the page dedicated to her, started with the words Olga Tokarczuk, an anti-Polish writer. Somebody wrote that, and it was like for a day there. It seems that Tokarczuk's anti-Polishness is linked in the Polish right-wing discourse not only to the content of her books, but also to the political affiliations to which the content of her books points to, and not just the content of her books. A few days after receiving the Nobel Prize in October 2019, the parliamentary elections were to be held in Poland. Tokarczuk then appealed to Poles. I would like to say to all my friends, people in Poland, let's vote the right way for democracy. Of course, she meant the liberal opposition. although it seems she's more aligned with the left, right? Because she's ecological, there's feminist discourse and all of that. Nevertheless, in Poland, the left doesn't have enough power to defeat the right. So the liberal opposition is close enough or good enough, I don't know. And besides, even in the right-wing discourse, there seems to be very little difference between the liberal and the left. They constitute a single cultural project called leftist. It is precisely this cultural project and its inherent vision of Poland, built on the idea of European internationalism, that the right finds unacceptable. This is what Tomasz Rowiński wrote about Tokarczuk and her Polish readers in the online conservative journal Teologia Polityczna, Political Theology. Today, Tokarczuk is read, in my opinion, by those who have not reflected on the so-called transformation and live with sentiment for the 1990s, or have reflected on it in the direction of expansion. From a model of political economic transformation to a belief in the necessity of replacing existing Polish culture in a process of endless westernization. Tokarczuk's readers are therefore people who share the principles of cosmopolitan and liberal bourgeoisie, the social idea of the first quarter century of freedom, cultural beneficiaries of the model of the revolution of 1989. A revolution not so much against communism, because the post-communists were its co-creators and co-victors, but the revisionist revolution, revising the model of westernization of Poland. So Tokarczuk's readers seem to be liberals and their bourgeoisie supporters who have built the Poland of their dream on Mickiewicz's internationalist idea, which according to the right wing annihilates Poland as a sovereign entity in the political and cultural sense. And this is also true according to Jarosław Marek Rymkiewicz. Jarosław Marek Rymkiewicz seems like an obvious figure in the context of Adam Mickiewicz's thought, or at least more obvious than Olga Tokarczuk. Rymkiewicz was one of the most important contemporary interpreters of Polish Romanticism, engaging with Mickiewicz's work for decades. He wrote about his literary works, his political thought, and his biography. Kinderszenen, however, does not belong to this body of texts. Rather, it's a self-referential book in which the author, through loosely connected scenes, memories, and reflections, revisits his childhood spent in the shadow of the World War II and the Warsaw Uprising. The text balances the form of an essay, a journal, and a philosophical treatise, focusing less on facts and more on how to remember and process them. The main axis of the Uprising's plot is the story of a German tank bomb that exploded on Krakowskie Przedmieście Street in Warsaw, becoming a brutal symbol of the German cruelty and mass death of Poles, but also a source of aesthetic delight for Rymkiewicz. The story of an explosion, as the entire uprising, is described by Rymkiewicz as beautiful, even though the author spares no drastic bloody scenes of death and violence. We can even risk the thesis that it is the violence that makes the uprising and the whole World War II a source of Rymkiewicz's feeling of the sublime. It seems so even when Rymkiewicz describes his childhood memories. Even though the book focuses on family episodes and domestic histories, most of those images are marked by death, pain, violence, and trauma inflicted by the Germans and Russians, profoundly shaping the child's psyche. The author explores how traumatic images become embedded in memory, how they are processed and transformed by the imagination. Rymkiewicz seems to correlate his own experience with the tragic national history, questioning single-minded interpretations of the past, especially of the uprising seen as a national catastrophe that should have been avoided. Similarly to Tokarczuk's book, Rymkiewicz's book also contains all of the important threats of Mickiewicz's messianism. However, it is the nationalist aspect of Mickiewicz's thought that can be seen in the book in the most clear way. Rymkiewicz even openly declares it. He says, "On Sunday mornings during the war, my mother would read aloud to me Father of the Plague-Stricken and Angeli, poems by Juliusz Słowacki, another Polish romantic bard. Ominous reading, I sat at the foot of the bed in a long white shirt down to my ankles, and large tears fell on my mother's lace sheets. Elena is dead. Don't tell me you didn't cry then. I cried with horror and with joy that I was Polish. Anyone who read Angeli in early childhood placed their faith in the hands of a higher power. They would be a Polish patriot, or, to put it in more bluntly, a nationalist. Like internationalism in Tokarczuk's book, nationalism in Rymkiewicz is primarily visible in the concept of law, which in a less obvious way than in Tokarczuk is linked to the concept of the border. While in Tokarczuk's book law functions as an internal Polish instrument of violence, in Kinderszenen the concept of law takes on a radically external form, an alien and violent means of regulating and destroying Polish life. Law appears in Kinderszenen almost exclusively in the context of statements made by Hans Frank, a German lawyer and National Socialist functionary who was the Governor General of the Polish territories occupied by the Germans in the period 1939-1945. Rymkiewicz begins by quoting what appears to be the less controversial statements made by Frank on the subject of law. Never, said Frank, was it possible to imagine a state without law or against law. The state of law, as the experience of world history teaches us, form a whole, and, I believe, internal holy law. A few pages later, Rymkiewicz goes on to quote Frank's statement about murders performed by the Nazis. He says, Frank says, "My gentlemen, we are not murderers. For a policeman or an SS man who, based on this order, is officially or professionally obliged to carry out an execution, this is a terrible task. Every police and SS commander who has the grave duty of carrying out these sentences must be 100% convinced that he is acting as an executor of the law of the German nation." Rymkiewicz, analyzing these statements, comes to the following conclusion. If the murder was founded on ancient Germanic law, then it wasn't murder. It had nothing to do with murder at all. It was an administration of justice. The vision of law that emerges here is undoubtedly terrifying. As with Mickiewicz, law is a sanctioned evil. Yet Rymkiewicz's evil goes even further. It serves not so much to enslave the weak through the category of property, but rather to physically exterminate those who refuse to submit to external German domination. Moreover, as in Mickiewicz's thought, this law is an expression of an alien civilizational trend in which reason and its derivative, order, play the leading role. Rymkiewicz suggests this clearly when he writes, "There's more to be said here. The entire uprising caused terrible chaos and was, by its very nature, a terrible chaos. And this chaos called upon those who opposed it, noble German soldiers, to restore order." Similarly to Mickiewicz, the civilization of reason that organizes chaos is a disease, and the most dangerous of all, a moral disease or a disease of the soul, a madness that Rymkiewicz juxtaposes with the attitude of Poles during the Warsaw Uprising. Rymkiewicz says, "The Warsaw Uprising, for various reasons, often propaganda, was portrayed as a great outburst of madness." And Rymkiewicz admits that there was an element of it. He says, "There was undoubtedly something of an amok in the uprising once it got underway, a kind of magnificent amok. Nevertheless, according to Mickiewicz, the madness of the Poles who decided on the mad uprising was only a response to the madness they faced, that is, to the murderous madness into which, for some incomprehensible reason, the German murderers had fallen. The German holy law, the law of murders, is therefore a sick and crazy law, alien to Poles untainted by it, and causing at most a magnificent Polish amok in response. This vision of law, however, is not limited solely to the now dead historical Nazi law. Rymkiewicz seems to draw significant analogies between that law and the law of European Union, which Poland joined 4 years before the publication of this book. We can see this clearly in the passages in which Frank's statement is quoted regarding the need for humanitarian action by the authorities towards citizens. This is the quote. In Heidelberg, the Governor General spoke out against the existence of police state. There should never be a police state. I reject that. And also against the death penalty. Europe wants to be humane. That means that there is no need to impose the death penalty on everything all the time. We want to be humane. There is no state that would suffer from harm because it acts humanely. All of this, Rymkiewicz now says, as we can see, was and even remains very up to date. Opposition to the police state and the death penalty are not the only points where Nazi law meets today's liberal European Union law. Rymkiewicz also finds statements by Frank in which he explicitly formulates an internationalist idea, referring to the need for international cooperation in Europe. In the speech in Rzeszów, says Rymkiewicz, Frank expressed his belief that the future German Europe must be a Europe of cooperation, and even if the Germans decide who will cooperate with whom there, this cooperation cannot be imagined without the participation of other nations. And later, among these foreign nations, there should be a guaranteed place for Poles. Speaking to the Germans of Rzeszów, he risked something like a compliment. He said that we are, or at least we can be, trustworthy people. Basically, Poles are, when treated politely and gently, the most trustworthy workforce in Europe, especially for permanent simple work. According to Rymkiewicz, in this case, we are dealing with something akin to prophecy, one that has come true, one that is coming true before our very eyes. A prophecy that the Poles, as a trustworthy force, will be of some use to Europe and their work will support the very order that the Germans will establish there. According to Rymkiewicz, Frank's prophecy is therefore being fulfilled. The European order is another incarnation of Nazi law, which despite its apparent humanitarianism has, as we remember, a structure of extermination. So according to Rymkiewicz, Frank's next prophecy refers to this new form of extermination. For the Poles, the Governor General continued, there is only one option, to put their energies at the service of Europe under German leadership, for their own good, their well-protected way of life and cultural distinctiveness. And later, what was on the mind of the Reich's General Governor, the Minister Dr. Hans Frank? He knew, and there is evidence for it, that the Nazi police state could not survive unless it legitimized itself, unless it justified itself, unless, in its murderous rages, it found some lasting legal basis. This was sensible, and it is now being realized before our eyes. An interesting realization is beginning. The suggestion seems clear enough. The law imposed on Poland by Nazi Germany remains in force and is being implemented in a new way, creating a new international civilization within the European Union, symbolically exterminating Polish national identity, just as foreign powers led to the disappearance of Polish state and the disappearance of Polish cultural distinctiveness in Mickiewicz's thought. What can survive in such conditions are only remnants of Polish culture. Foreign evil, in the guise of international law, has once again crossed our borders and symbolically exterminating us. Goodness, then, as in the nationalist threat of Mickiewicz's thought, can only be sought inside. Rymkiewicz also builds this moral axis in his childhood memories. Talking about some childhood memory, Rymkiewicz states, I was not a German boy, but a Polish one. That is, I lived on the side of good and not on the side of evil. This statement conceals an extremely serious and very Mickiewiczian diagnosis. Good and evil are linked to nationality. Rymkiewicz's nationalism, like Mickiewicz's, is an ontological distinction that organizes access to ethics. Externality, especially in the form of law, German and European, will always be an attack on the good. And it seems, according to Rymkiewicz, this attack has once again been carried out. And perhaps we might need another uprising. This vision of Polish community made Rymkiewicz, of course, a favorite writer of the Polish right, while he was hated by liberal circles. This is a fragment from an article about Rymkiewicz by Michał Olszewski, published in Gazeta Wyborcza, which still is the most important liberal media outlet in Poland. The title is very telling. Jarosław Marek Rymkiewicz, poet of good change. The good change is a political slogan used by the right-wing party Law and Justice. Olszewski writes, Jarosław Marek Rymkiewicz made a crucial gesture. He codified the mythology of the Polish right in 4 books, dozens of interviews, and a handful of political poems, and Kinderszenen being one of the 4 books. The description, poet of a good change, doesn't seem like an exaggeration. Rymkiewicz, like Tokarczuk, made no secrets of his political sympathies. In an interview published on the right-wing website W Sieci in early 2016, after the Law and Justice Party won the parliamentary elections, Rymkiewicz said, "We voted to save Poland. Law and Justice won the election because Poles understood that they were being denationalized. They understood that Poland was being insulted, humiliated, ridiculed, and that everything happening on our lands was aimed at the destruction of Poland." This destruction, of course, was carried out by the pro-European liberals in Rymkiewicz's mind. So, what does it all say? I would say that Tokarczuk and Rymkiewicz are not simply 2 writers who happen to find themselves on the opposite sides of Polish political disputes. Their work reveals a profound split within the Polish imagination, a split that paradoxically stems from the same source, Mickiewicz. What we encounter in Mickiewicz's writing is not a simple synthesis of nationalism and internationalism, but rather a paradoxical construction in which the 2 tendencies coexist in a constant state of tension. This contradiction has never been resolved within the Mickiewicz's thought. Instead, it produced a symbolic structure in which both poles seem necessary and mutually constitutive. The 2 cannot be separated, yet they continuously clash. In this sense, Mickiewicz's legacy prefigures the antagonism of Polish contemporary politics. But because it's apparently impossible for the 2 threads to exist within one ideological framework, they split. The nationalist thread resonates today with the rhetoric of the conservative and right-wing movements. Meanwhile, the internationalist thread is echoed in the liberal discourses. Tokarczuk and Rymkiewicz represent a division that exists not only in the Polish parliament, but also in Polish society that is divided almost down the middle. Both the liberals and the right enjoy mass support in Poland, and Poles themselves are deeply involved in the dispute between the political representative, who swap places as government and opposition every 4 or 8 years. It seems that the antagonism is not accidental but structural. They were designed to coexist this way by Mickiewicz himself, who inscribed in the Polish symbolic order a division that continues to animate and destabilize it. Or to put it differently, the father of Polishness created Polishness already broken, split into contradictory imperatives that create 2 civilizational projects. Those imperatives still endure, fighting one another, but unable to live without each other, since they define themselves in opposition to each other, to this day creating Polish political reality. The work of Tokarczuk and Rymkiewicz, like the ongoing cultural and political conflict between the liberals and the right, demonstrates that Mickiewicz's thought is still very much alive in Poland. The romantic paradigm persists, and it manifests itself as an antagonism not only in the Polish parliament, but also within the very structure of Polish identity. So it seems that we can treat what Mickiewicz wrote in his poem Ekskuza as yet another prophecy. He says, like prophet, like listener. And yes, Polish society seems to still be listening to Mickiewicz's words, but one half hears something completely different than the other half, and each half considers the other sick. Thank you.